I won't try to sing. Well, telling us whether the text on this slide is true is the role of our next speaker. Introducing him is saying space exploration with capital letters. It's saying big science of the multi-decadal programmatic kind of Mars exploration. That is Scot Hubbard. Scot Hubbard played a pivotal role in that big science program for decades. So having him briefing us on how we did vis-a-vis Mars in the years since the last Humans to Mars summit in 2014 only makes excellent sense. Therefore, I give you all Scot Hubbard.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks very much to Explore Mars Incorporated for the invitation to talk to you. I think I have the opportunity to expand on and amplify on the comments of the administrator. I don't know if Charlie's departed yet or not. Did he? Right there? There he is. Okay, good to see you. And before I get started, Charlie, excellent appointment of Dr. Eugene Tu as the new director of Ames. I couldn't be more delighted. He will serve the agency well. Well, as Artemis said, I was asked to talk about the, they're going to, here, we have a permanent fix for this. Excellent.
Just a piece of wood.
Yeah. Simple is good. To talk about the year in review. And I took the license of the speaker and expanded this just a little bit to say the year in review, a window of opportunity. And I truly believe this. I think we have a window of opportunity to build a consensus for a long-term, cost-constrained, executable Humans to Mars program. And all of those words were chosen with great care. And I think particularly the word executable is extremely important. So I put together this talk along the lines of doing some strategic planning or doing what some people call scenario planning. We're going to look at the current landscape for Humans to Mars. Where are we today? We're going to look at some strengths, some weaknesses, some threats, some opportunities, what they call SWOT analysis. And then, where should we go from here? Future strategic and policy directions. The material I'm using for this came from the Affording Mars workshops that Explore Mars conducted. I was able to speak to one of those, as well as a workshop that I chaired very recently under the sponsorship of the Planetary Society, and a finding that was put forward to the administrator very recently by the NASA Advisory Council. And full disclosure, I serve on the NASA Advisory Council, so I have some blame or some responsibility for that. I'm going to take the time to read you that finding. My friends and colleagues in NASA have already seen this. A few in the media have, but it's not clear that everybody has heard this. So what we found was that developing an executable exploration strategy with plausible costs leading to humans on Mars in the 2030s would help NASA build the consensus necessary for such a program. As Administrator Bolden said, without the support of the public and the elected officials, the Congress, and multiple administrations, we won't get there. In addition, creating a well-articulated and, yes, costed plan will allow for independent assessment of progress. How you doing? Toward the goal of landing humans on Mars. And this framework then will allow international and commercial partners to participate. Next, the horizon goal of sending humans to Mars has been established by many different studies, including last year's National Research Council report entitled Pathways to Exploration. Numerous administrations have adopted this goal, and as Charlie said, if you look at everything that NASA has done the last 40 years, there have been elements that have led toward the goal of humans on Mars. But setting a goal, the Council found, is necessary but not sufficient. A long-term strategy and corresponding plans must also be developed that accompany that goal. So what the Council meant when it said a strategy and a set of plans was milestones, at least notionally, launches, hardware development that are sufficiently defined to allow a cost estimate. Because I think, as I hope to demonstrate to you, we are past the point of worrying about cost studies done 25 years ago. And there is an opportunity today, a window of opportunity, to move forward. Now, NASA has articulated extremely well the near-term plan. Bill Gerstenmaier, the head of human exploration, has laid out a 5-year plan under the umbrella of what's called the Evolvable Mars Campaign study. The Council in this finding was concerned that waiting to lay out the options for the longer-term plan for humans on Mars will miss this window of opportunity of emerging public enthusiasm, and that if you don't lay out this plan, you will create uncertainty in partners and decision makers. So I have for you today 2 key propositions. The first is that the Mars exploration community, writ large, that's all of us, it's NASA, it's industry, it's the public, it's the elected officials. We have a near-term window to establish a long-term, executable, sustainable Humans to Mars program, but if we don't, others will seize this opportunity. There's only so much money available. If you don't have a plan to use that funding that is clear and is costed and is executable, other people will make demands for that funding, and we will once again be 30 years away from humans on Mars. So what's the current landscape? Let's pretend we're doing a strategic planning exercise here. Where are we today? There's a lot of emerging public advocacy. A legacy organization, been around 30 plus years, almost 35 years, the Planetary Society, recently re-endorsed the whole idea of humans to Mars. That organization has primarily, recently, been concerned with robotic exploration, but they agreed to sponsor the workshop that I chaired that came out with a very powerful endorsement for humans on Mars. And there are new organizations, maybe not less than 10 years old, less than 5 years old. There's ExploreMars Incorporated, the sponsor of this meeting, that have been conducting excellent workshops with very bright people with good ideas, giving voice to those ideas. There's Dennis Tito's Inspiration Mars, where he aims to partially fund a 2-person journey to Mars that would need some NASA capabilities. Will he get there? I don't know, but he at least stated that he was putting a $100 million marker out there. And then there's Mars One. Interesting group of people. I've talked to Bas Lansdorp numerous times. It's my sense, some people call it a scam. I think that Bas is serious, sincere, let's say, but extraordinarily uninformed about the difficulties of getting to Mars. But nevertheless, whatever the lack of engineering might be, he got 200,000 expressions of interest. So to me, the bottom line is there is a new, less than 5 years old, public interest in humans to Mars. There is new popular culture interest as well. The Martian, which is a fascinating book, it's loaded with engineering detail, which surprised me. When I wrote my book about reconstructing the Mars program, the publisher said, "Hey, don't put that, that's too much, you got too much math in there." And Andy Weir's book is just loaded with it, and it's a bestseller. So maybe that means the public is a lot smarter than we give them credit for. It's a major motion picture. It's coming out this November, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Matt Damon. There is another movie that's just now getting into production called Out of This World. It's about the first child born on Mars. They just signed Asa Butterfield, who starred in Ender's Game, to headline that, and it's being directed by Peter Chelsom and produced by Relativity Studios. So there are movies that appeal to popular culture saying, we can go to Mars, we can be on Mars. We might even have kids born on Mars. NASA's plans for Mars during this past year, by the way, I was delighted to hear, Administrator Bolden, what you had to say this morning. I think that's just terrific, the leadership you provided in saying, here's some new things we're going to do. Back in July of last year, NASA Advisory Council, in a recommendation, recommended that NASA put together a minimum path to Mars with a cost associated with it. The answer that we got on the NAC was that the Evolvable Mars campaign was underway, and that would lead to the journey to Mars. Most of you have seen this. These are NASA charts. And that if we needed, the community needed an architecture to evaluate, we should look at Design Reference Architecture number 5 in 2009, but that was all that was available. And that's a responsible answer, particularly living inside the Beltway and the political environment we've got. I spent 20 years with the agency. I understand how you have to work things in the political environment, but those answers received some criticism. Tom Young, one of the elder gods of the aerospace community, said, well, if what you've got is, as it says here, a series of capabilities-based efforts that hold open architecture decisions, that was what the statement said on Evolvable Mars, he criticized that by saying, if you are on that path alone, by 20 years from now, you will have spent $160 billion and be no closer to humans on Mars than we are today. On the other hand, if you look at Design Reference Architecture number 5, as the National Academy did in their NRC report, Pathways to Exploration, where it says Mars is the horizon goal, but if you look at what's in that architecture and say, if we want to be on Mars by 2033, then you have this enormous spike there of something like 3 times the human spaceflight budget. On the other hand, in that architecture, if you let it stay within the human spaceflight budget with inflation, you don't get to humans on Mars until almost 2050. And while I fully understand NASA's predicament of working in the political environment, neither of these outcomes are desirable. We need to do something a little bit different. Now, many people say, we'll have another Kennedy moment. We'll be saved by a big spike in the budget where we get 4% of the disposable federal income. Not going to happen. One of my longtime friends and colleagues, arguably the dean of space policy people in the whole world, John Logston, did an analysis of, in several books, the Kennedy moment, and recently Nixon's involvement in the space program. And he said that his answer to the Kennedy moment, will it come again? No. And that is particularly true because it was under Richard Nixon's administration that NASA was moved from a special program to one that must compete with all other agencies for their funding. So we will not be saved, in my view, by some extraordinary plus-up in NASA's budget, in the space exploration budget. So what do? People also say, we can't afford to go to Mars. It's way too expensive. It costs $1 trillion. That's also not true. Hum Mandel, who was there at the beginning of what was called the 90-day study, this is 26 years ago that this study was done, and saw and has now given a very nice report. He published this. He's given this presentation a couple of times, I understand at least once to NASA headquarters, in which he lays out all of the extraordinarily bad assumptions that were made. For example, in the 90-day study in 1989, they took as a baseline NASA's existing budget. They layered on that a complete lunar exploration and layered on that a complete Mars exploration. Well, no wonder it got to $500 billion. So the point of Mandel's presentation that Joe Hamaker gave for him at the workshop I chaired a few weeks ago was that these past estimates don't apply. They're irrelevant. They're close to being bogus. If someone tells you that there's some historical precedent for humans to Mars costing $500 billion, don't believe them. It's not true. What we need to do is to look at an architecture we have today with cost analysis we have today, and with those tools we can show that it's affordable. So we have lots of good news. Part of the good news is that SLS is underway. Orion is being tested. Some of the key hardware that we need is being developed even as we speak. We have commercial resupply going. We have SpaceX. We have Orbital Sciences that are returning to flight even though they had some problems with a recent mishap. There's been a selection for commercial crew, Boeing and SpaceX, as was mentioned by Charlie. We even have good news on radiation effects. This was a presentation given by Rich Williams, the Chief Medical Officer of NASA, to the NASA Advisory Council back in January. And I'll point to the third bullet on his chart there. He said, there are no crew health risks at this time that are considered mission stoppers for a human mission to Mars. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to continue research. It doesn't mean it's a serious issue, but the way I would characterize Dr. Williams' talk is that radiation effects have moved from a huge unknown to something where there is a range of risk that can be evaluated and presented for informed consent to the astronauts that are applying to go to Mars. This is a very big deal because in the past, when I have given talks about sending humans to Mars and been asked what are the really big issues, radiation was always one of those. So what do we do next? We need clarity of purpose, of budget, of politics. We need a simple statement about what we're doing. The Planetary Society workshop proposed humans orbiting Mars 2033. We need to assume a flat budget with inflation. Don't expect a Kennedy moment. In fact, I would argue that you do not want a presidential initiative because with the polarized politics we have today, if one president proposes it, another will oppose it. So I think what we need is leadership, but we need to drive a community consensus. We need continuous independent assessments of how we're doing and what it costs. And somebody has to be in charge. I think that's critical. We need to bring communities together. Science, human exploration need to be coordinated, collaborative, even interdependent. And you need a strategic framework that will involve international partners. And then finally, we need commerce. We need a trailing edge of economic development. Sustainability is not possible without a new business ecosystem. So let's learn something from the Robotic Mars Science Program that I had the extraordinary opportunity to restructure 15 years ago now. And what we found there was that if we adopted some of these principles, we could in fact construct a mission queue based on science, but also involving all the other elements in major mission development, and have something that was successful and has been successful for 15 years. That process we called program systems engineering. And in the case of humans to Mars, I would replace science with exploration. So we have 3 different strategies: an exploration strategy, technology readiness, we have programmatics, budget, launch dates, and so forth. And you need to align those 3 and iterate on them. It's somewhat of a messy process, but when you do and you apply these principles consistently, you will come out with a mission queue that achieves your purpose. And the JPL team study you're going to hear about tomorrow is one excellent example of this minimum architecture. So a little bit more about applying these principles, first to human spaceflight. It means that cost has to be a consideration from the very beginning. You can't build the perfect architecture and then start to apply cost constraints. This must be fundamental to developing the architecture. Second, I would argue that decisions about going to an asteroid or the moon have to be based on cost and the enabling architecture that you need to get to Mars. Mars is the goal. And then you need continuous non-advocate assessments so that you really truly know what you're buying into. As the administrator said, the existing expertise for getting to Mars, to the surface of Mars, currently resides within NASA. ESA is planning to demonstrate that in 2016 and 2018. And if they do, they can also bring their expertise to the table. And next, we talk about the convergence of the science community and the human spaceflight community. And there is a place for that. When I was the first Mars czar and was asked to look at where the convergence of these two communities might be, I made this simple Venn diagram. I didn't quite know what was in that place between science, those are the old names, by the way, for the science organizations, and the Human Exploration Organization, but I knew it was there. Years later, my colleague Orlando Figueroa led something called the Mars Program Planning Group, and he had access to much better graphics than I did, and he produced this diagram. It was very similar, saying there is an intersection in science, human exploration, and technology, and that's where we need to focus. But, as I've said before, a goal is necessary, but not sufficient. This is straight out of the Planetary Decadal Survey. This is what it says through the National Academy about bringing humans and science exploration together. And it says that if humans are going to visit the moon, asteroids, or Mars, collecting and returning high-quality samples are among the most scientifically important things that they can do. These two efforts must be synergistic, both at the program level, that is to say, you've got science missions to Mars and humans to Mars. You've also got the opportunity to have humans working with robotic assistants. Both of these will drive the development of new technology. But as you go forward, you've got to remember that we have a science space budget that is allocated through the peer review process, and we need to maintain that. That's a bedrock principle of how you do science throughout the universe. Next, in terms of cost constraints, NASA can afford one human spaceflight program at any given time, not two. So the International Space Station should be used to inform humans to Mars and then hand it off in some fashion. The way that this was done with 16 nations is a model for future human exploration, but the funding that goes to ISS must be used to fund humans to Mars. And then finally, commercial space. Why do we care about this so much? Well, clearly it provides the basis for less expensive transport to low Earth orbit, maybe beyond. The entrepreneurs are co-investing. At least one CEO, Elon Musk, has said he wants to retire on Mars. And then he is, in fact, developing one of the tools that will be critical to getting to the surface of Mars. Supersonic retropropulsion is a key technology for putting large mass on the surface of Mars. And then finally, all of this change in the way that we are doing commercial cargo and commercial crew is having a profound effect. I know my students at Stanford are eager to join these new companies, and older affluent citizens are have on their bucket list the desire to go to at least the edge of space. As Brewster Shaw, a longtime astronaut and corporate executive, said, the more people that go, the more that will want to go. So we need to harness all this energy. Final bit of advice for the community as represented by those of you here. How was it that the program that Firuz Naderi and I and a huge team of people led, this program we set in motion, how did it last for 15 years? Well, it was a great team. It's a good plan, well executed, it fit the budget, and there was buy-in over time by everybody, academia, the National Academy, advisory structures, Office of Management and Budget, all of the different groups throughout the executive branch, the House Science Committee, the authorization, the appropriations, all these people eventually, when they were presented with a thoughtful, executable plan, came around to support it. Now, it takes a lot of work. I wore out a lot of shoe leather doing that. So after we have consensus on an executable plan, go out and sell it. Talk to everybody. Space should be not only bipartisan, but nonpartisan. So in wrapping up, I often use this graphic when I'm giving a presentation to a general audience, and I'll point out about how Mars is today, how it probably was in the past, that it might be an abode for humans in the future. And the message I want to leave with you is that if we pull together with community consensus on an executable program, we can do this. Thank you. So Chris Carberry is saying to stay on time, we can take a question. Oh, there's some hands over here. All right, right there.
Good morning, sir. Quick question on private spaceflight. With it progressing as quickly as possible and at least one CEO expressing interest in going on their own, what do you see as a possible interplay between private spaceflight to Mars and NASA's goals over the next couple decades?
Excellent question, and I think the thing I have to point out is that Elon Musk and SpaceX are in business to make a profit. They are, while they're putting some of their own money in, particularly in the beginning, they nevertheless need NASA and maybe other government investments that are their sales, that's their income, and they're using some of their money to fund these other activities. But I believe what you're likely to see is more in the nature of a public-private partnership, or where, let's say, SpaceX or one of the other companies develops a technology or a vehicle that the government can acquire at much lower cost. And so that's the direction that I see it going in. People talk about a completely private initiative to go to Mars. I don't see that as being possible without co-investment. It is, I think it's affordable, but affordable in the sense of these groups working together. So with that, thank you very much. I'll turn it back to Artemis.